In 2003, a friend of mine persuaded me to head to the Guggenheim with him one weekday morning to see the much-discussed Matthew Barney show. We found Frank Lloyd Wright's concentric circle hallways scattered with set pieces from his famous Cremaster cycle, along with other assorted Barney works, as numerous monitors played various segments of the 5 films throughout the museum. On the ground floor lobby, Vaseline oozed from what looked like a very wide kiddie pool. Barney was the hottest American artist of the moment and had been able to create his cinematic magnum opus with what appeared to be, for a contemporary artist at least, unlimited financial resources. Once I began to disregard the detritus of physical objects around me and focus on the films themselves, it was easy to get caught up in the strange and unsettling bits of Cremaster action. At the appointed hour, my friend and I proceeded to the auditorium where we hoped to sit through all of Cremaster 3, but after 45 minutes, we began to feel as though our time would be better spent drinking wine downtown. The elaborate and high-budget expression of Barney's artistic vision was at once mind-bending with its obsessive attention to detail, and hopelessly vague when it came to specificity of tone or worldview. In spite of the dazzling sensuality of its surfaces and the acute mystery of its dramas, the final product was almost oppressively inert. As chance would have it, some curator at the Guggenheim, or intentionally or by accident, had decided to mount a concurrent show of paintings by Kazimir Malevich in the adjacent galleries. Feeling unmoored and a bit uneasy by the vagaries of Matthew Barney, we were about to leave when I suggested we first wander over to the North Galleries for a brief look at the Russian suprematists' mauled black and white paintings. It was here, as I went from the circus of prostheses, flayed horses, and bizarre costumes, to the solitary black and white squares, that I had a revelation. Malevich was more than a historical figure who changed the trajectory of art when he introduced a radical new formalism almost a century before. He was a painter whose reductive vision appeared as powerful as I suspected it must have been in 1915, and whose works actually lived up to the mystical claims of his manifesto. Barney utilized a self-constructed cinematic language of Baroque symbols and forms, some of which may have alluded to the frontier culture of the Rocky Mountains, the rules of high school football, or the rites of the Church of Latter-day Saints. At their best, the Cremaster series strived to evoke the presence of some powerful, elusive spirit force, but the cumulative effect was a kind of hollow discordance. By contrast, Malevich's paintings elicited a profound sense of alignment and resolution that seemed to exist far beyond the parameters of their small canvases. Donald Judd's famous statement, "It is obvious now that the forms and colors in the paintings that Malevich began painting in 1915 are the first instances of form and color," suddenly made perfect sense to me. The ability of Malevich to reduce the elements of form and color to the very essence of form and color are deeply rooted in a phenomenology of asceticism, a practice as ancient as it was modern. The key tenet of asceticism is a transcendence from the physical realm, with its various manifestations as subject and object, towards a recognition and understanding of the primacy of essences and qualities. With asceticism, there must be self-denial. Historically, the ascetic is often a religious being who renounces all worldly pleasures and possessions in favor of meditation or prayer. In the particular case of the artist, however, he or she makes the choice not to be seduced by narrative, drama, or sensuality surrounding the landscape, figure, or gesture, so that he or she can focus on those properties more vast and eternal. Often a reaction against an environment where art is too subjective, historical, culturally contextualized, decadent, or simply lacking rigor, the reductive impulse has always been with us. Even in the absence of such circumstances, it may have the capacity to spontaneously engender itself within the artist's being. The reductive impulse can be found throughout Western history. While Malevich may best represent the inherent values of artistic reductivism, it can also be experienced in a wide range of art in a variety of media, including Christian monophonic liturgies, classical Indian music, Buddhist chant, the whirling of Sufi dervishes, the modal jazz of Miles Davis, the choreography of Merce Cunningham, the non-narrative ballet of George Balanchine, and much contemporary classical music from John Cage onwards. In some areas of the United States, the presence of Calvinist religious beliefs, which frown upon musical instruments and craven images, have led to an indigenous American reductivism that finds expression in Amish quilts, Shaker furniture, and in the 1960s, the aesthetics of minimalism. Reductivism is usually characterized by an extreme degree of formal abstraction, but reductivism and abstraction are two distinct, though closely related phenomena. Abstraction is based upon reductive principles and techniques, but its motivations and outcomes may be different than those of reductive art. Malevich's predecessors, the Cubists, Cezanne, and the Impressionists, all utilized an abstraction, a reduction of formal elements, to establish the idea of a separation and a dialogue between the external world and our own perception of it. Later artists, like the abstract expressionists, use reductive methods in their paintings to give physical form to powerful internal forces existing within. Within modern and contemporary art, we see strains of both abstraction and reductivism. While most abstract art manifests a more conventional Western dualism, art that seeks to be purely reductive embodies a philosophical monism found far less frequently in our history. Nothing is represented or referenced. The work's unified thingness is its justification for being. Malevich was forced by the Soviet art hierarchy to abandon his suprematism in favor of the concurrent, machine-oriented constructivism, then by Stalin to give up decadent abstraction altogether for socialist figurative painting. He died in Moscow in 1935, but his reductive legacy would live on in minimalism, which would emerge in the United States and England decades later, and be defined as a movement in the 1960s. Minimalism is a problematic term, and one, like reductive itself, it has been largely rejected by the artists to whom it has been attached. It described a loose group of sculptors and painters who had rejected the then dominant mode of abstract expressionism, and others that draw upon established European art traditions to directly explore, as Malevich had, the more fundamental properties of form, light, space, and color. This so-called movement became recognized by the public when the Jewish Museum of New York organized the seminal Primary Structures exhibit in 1966, featuring the work of Donald Judd, Dan Flavin, Ellsworth Kelly, Tony Smith, Robert Smithson, John McCracken, Carl Andre, Robert Morris, Ann Truitt, Walter de Maria, Larry Bell, Anthony Caro, and Saul LeWitt, among others. Judd, who was also a prolific and highly intellectual critic, sought to demystify both the art object and the role of the artist by producing real materials in real space. His repetitious sequences of geometric shapes in wood, burnished metal, concrete or colored plexiglass, referred to as his progression or stack work, were initially mounted on walls or freestanding. Later on, he would abandon studio work intended for the gallery or museum to focus exclusively on large permanent installations, ultimately establishing his artistic compound in Marfa, Texas. But even as a studio artist, he had begun outsourcing the fabrication of his pieces in as early as 1964. In an off-cited moment at a panel discussion during Primary Structures, he countered sculptor Mark de Suvro's statement that real artists make their own art by making the claim, a provocative one at the time, that such relationships did not matter as long as works of art were the result. So the artist, whose actions were long associated with a kind of heroic romanticism, had become subject to reductive process. But the apotheosis of reductivism in the 20th century art would come in the 1970s, however, when California artist Robert Irwin began to create museum installations where the object disappeared completely, replaced only by the subtle effects of light passing through a scrim. It was at once a rejection of the illusory power of the art object and, as Irwin once stated in a lecture I attended here in Seattle, a means of lowering the viewer's sensory threshold. After this point, there was nothing more for the artist to reduce. The fundamental shortcoming of reductive art in its purest form is a hermetic self-referencing, and too often an uncompromising air of orthodoxy. For artists interested in issues that involve the body, gender, race, economics, politics, or the environment, there is little room within the confines of these constructions. Those who wish to explore the sensuality of the physical world, emotional states of being, the mystery of death, or anything having to do with sex must look elsewhere. The era of high minimalism is past, however, and Robert Irwin has been designing gardens now for 2 decades. But reductive art lives on in myriad forms within contemporary art. Perhaps more than any other time in history, today's artists have the freedom to work in whichever genre, tradition, or media they choose. There is no subject matter that cannot be addressed, no language that cannot be spoken, and no formal device that cannot be appropriated. In this vibrant, rapidly evolving art environment, the vocabulary of reductive art, as practiced by such figures as Malevich and Judd, has been completely absorbed and can be seen in nearly all permutations of contemporary art. The forms that reference minimalism are often used today as symbols of the lofty philosophical ideas associated with the movement. Sometimes they are employed as a means of sending up the pretensions, irrelevance, or failure of post-war art world values. They may express a reverence, even mourning, for the integrity of the physical object, or the grand ambitions of a generation of artists who upheld the conceptual purity. One post-minimalist artist who has subsumed them for such purposes is Seattle's Roy McMacken, a furniture maker and interior designer whose current show is now on view at Western Bridge, entitled, "I Continue to Believe in the Potential to Express Hope and Sorrow Through Furniture." Subverting their iconic power by recasting them in a utilitarian context, he humanizes their presence and gives them a new and broader significance. Incorporating a pop art irony borrowed from Ed Ruscha, his titles and occasional use of text in his work add subtle elements of humor and sadness. For German artist Wolfgang Leib, whose 1996 work, Pollen from Hazelnut, was recently on view at the Henry Art Gallery, minimalism, which often sought a harmony and stasis removed from the natural world cycles of life and death, is infused literally with nature. The beautiful yellow iridescence, translucence of this rectangle, which appears to float in midair just above the ground, is the result of massing large quantities of the hazelnut's coarse, powdery male gametes. The softness, transience, and reproductive nature of the media can be looked upon conceptually both as a repudiation and an expansion of high minimalism. In today's art, highly reductive work need not have anything to do with the mysticism of Malevich or the phenomenology of Irwin. The reductive impulse would more likely be a response to the artist's status within an increasingly uncertain and materialistic world than any program of philosophical inquiry. Historically, artists have always struggled to gain recognition or eke out a good living. This is nothing new. But today seems different. Like the United States and much of the rest of the planet, the economy of the art world suffers from huge inequities. A highly profitable art market flourishes among a 1%, while most of the rest have had to endure the fallout of a severe, prolonged economic meltdown. One remembers how, on the day after the stock market crashed in September 2008, 223 of Damien Hirst's works sold for $200 million at Sotheby's. Artists such as Hirst, Jeff Koons, and Takahashi Murakami, each of whom incidentally can be said to have incorporated the vernacular of minimalism in their work, have thrived in this marketplace. They function in a dual role where they engage the rarefied economic stratosphere both as multi-millionaire businessmen and as performance artist social critics. It's nice work if you can get it, but the vast majority of artists possess objectives that would make such participation as unimaginable as it is undesirable. Add to our economic downturns the frustration with and perceived irrelevance of key institutions, including art galleries, museums, and schools. A general sense of fatigue and alienation from a new technology infrastructure, including the matrix of smartphones, social networking sites, and the unlimited storage and retrieval of digital information. And the steady erosion of faith in our political and financial systems, and it's often hard to see a way forward. But artists will continue to do what they've always done, work on the scale and in the manner that suits their goals and ambitions. Many will respond to the uncertainty and chaos of our current world with a powerful urge to strip away, pare down, or distill a sensation or an idea to reveal some deeper truth or beauty. Reductive art will endure, as we see here in this gallery tonight. Steve Costi renders visual landscapes into solid masses of graphite, which reclaim their vibrancy after being painstakingly vacuumed with a hoover and its brush attachment. The streaking and erasure brought by this subtraction suggest a synchronized movement on the horizon and in our retinas. Choosing alternately as his subject the urban panorama of Venice and the monolithic sculptures of Richard Serra, another artist usually lumped with minimalism, he reveals their essential kinetic sameness. Like Irwin, but using photography as his medium, Graham Shutt creates images that break down light into a broad spectrum of physical manifestations, leaving its sources and surfaces unrecognizable or completely absent. Vanessa Tran uses heavy applications of oil to paint, of oil paint to define and obscure the image of an ancient tree in a series of small works on paper. Her neutral palette, a thick convergence of Watteau's greens and browns, seems to cancel itself out into colorlessness, just as the trunk and limbs of her symbolic subjects seem to fade in and out of our vision. Imagining the interior spaces of Judd's signature process work in his prints, David Brody reproduces their characteristic surfaces into enclosed rectilinear planes. While remaining abstract, they contain smaller Judd-like forms within them, some of which look like shadows, beds with headboards, and comforters. Like McMacken, he both embraces and expands upon Judd while having a laugh at his expense. The most reductive artist in this show is Dwayne Zaludek. What at first appears to be a pale blank piece of paper becomes, upon closer inspection, a barely discernible ground line or horizon. In other works, we question, then confirm that we were looking at looming square towers in front of his. The movement of lines in and out of our vision, our field of vision, is the result of watercolors carefully applied to a gessoed paper from a long closed mill. As a viewer and sometime art critic, I truly believe in the power and redemptive properties of art that falls within this reductive tradition. As happened during my aforementioned trip to the Guggenheim in 2003, I found myself during a stay in New York City 2 years ago, exhausted and confused after a week packed with museum exhibits and studio visits. My friend, the same who had accompanied me to the Barney show, perhaps remembering our accidental stumble upon the Malevich paintings, suggested we spend a day at the Dia Beacon up the Hudson. The cumulative experience of seeing the large installations by Judd, Dan Flavin, and Michael Heiser, the labyrinth of patterned, pencil-drawn walls by Sol LeWitt, the small monochromatic paintings by Agnes Martin and Richard Ryman, and the floor-bound grid of square metal by Carl Andre had an amazing grounding effect. My interaction with them was centered, not disrupting. Only later, when I returned to the city, did it occur to me how rare this phenomenon is, both in art and in life. All right. Thanks.